Let me start with a conclusion that might make a lot of people uncomfortable. The hill forts scattered across the high ground of Britain were never really built for war. They were event venues. They were periodic large-scale gatherings, backed by an extremely aggressive branding strategy. The earthen walls and the ditches were the logo. The feasting, the grain storage, the rituals, those were the actual product. The reason we got this wrong for 200 years is because we gave these places the wrong name. The word hill fort is a trap in itself. Hill points to terrain, fort implies defense, and the moment you put them together your brain automatically conjures up archers crouching behind earthen ramparts. But when archaeologists actually got inside these sites and started digging, what they found looked nothing like that. Danebury is one of the most thoroughly excavated hill forts in Britain. Archaeologist Barry Cunliffe spent decades there and documented over 500 storage pits. These pits were not randomly dug. They were distributed according to a recognizable spatial logic, with clear separation between grain storage zones, animal activity areas, and waste disposal areas. The contents were managed differentially. Some pits contained clean processed grain. Others were mixed with straw seeds. Archaeobotanical analysis showed that the grain had been centrally threshed and processed before going into the pits. This was not individual households processing their own grain and then pooling it together. What does that tell us? It tells us someone was managing all of this grain at a level above the individual family. Not you store yours and I store mine, but a structure sitting above any single household that controlled storage and distribution. The animal bone evidence is even more direct. Bone assemblages from Danebury and Maiden Castle show that horse skulls and dog bones appear at frequencies far exceeding what you would expect from ordinary food waste. Butchery marks cluster on specific body parts in ways that do not look like casual daily meat consumption. And here is the key finding. Using dental cementum annuli to determine the season of death, researchers found that large-scale slaughter events were concentrated in late autumn and early winter, not spread evenly across the year. Explosive and seasonal. That is feasting evidence. Large-scale, collective, seasonal feasting. The traditional assumption was that hill forts were continuously occupied settlements, but stratigraphic analysis is dismantling that assumption at site after site. At Yeavering Bell and South Cadbury and others, the stratigraphic sequences contain obvious gap periods, sediment layers representing extended stretches of near-zero human activity, alternating with phases of intense use. This is not a picture of people living there and then moving away. This is periodic activation, opened up and used and then closed down again. Pollen and phytolith analysis from sediments around hill fort perimeters tells the same story. Vegetation cover drops sharply in certain phases, then partially recovers, then drops again. This rhythmic landscape disturbance matches the internal stratigraphic rhythm of the sites perfectly. So the more accurate model is this. Hill forts were event spaces. They were not the backdrop to daily life. They were places that got switched on when certain collective events needed to happen. Assemblies, distributions, rituals, construction work. These activities pulled people in periodically and then the crowd dispersed. That is identical to the logic of a pop-up. Most of the time it just sits there. But it does its real work during the days or weeks when the crowd floods in. The hill forts were positioned on high ground first and foremost as visual proclamation. GIS viewshed analysis has shown that the major hill forts of southern Britain are mutually visible to a degree that is very unlikely to be accidental topographic coincidence. It looks far more like deliberate planning. You stand inside one hill fort and you can see another. Both communities know what the other is doing. This is an information network and a mutual confirmation of presence and status. The massive silhouette was the brand. Visible from miles away. It told everyone in the surrounding landscape that this place was the center, this place mattered, when the time came you needed to be here. But the really sophisticated design work happened at the entrances. The entrances at Maiden Castle and Hod Hill were not straight through gaps. The ramparts extended outward and curved, creating guiding corridors. You could not walk straight in. You were forced to move at specific angles, at a reduced pace, exposed to sightlines from inside the entire time. Three-dimensional spatial reconstruction has revealed that certain entrance designs created deliberate blind spots, giving people already inside time to reposition before newcomers arrived. This is not defense. Defense does not require this level of path choreography. This is experience design. It is managing how you enter the space, so that by the time you arrive inside, you have already been absorbed into a particular kind of order. Acoustic research pushes this further. Researchers ran digital acoustic modeling on multiple hillfort entrances and found that the curving corridors produced significant sound amplification effects. Sound generated inside was focused and projected toward the corridor exit. Noise from outside was absorbed and scattered by the ramparts. When a crowd assembled, people standing in specific positions could be heard across a much wider area than others. The space was deciding whose voice carried. That is a power structure made out of dirt and chalk. The storage pits had another dimension entirely. At many hillfort sites, pit bottoms contained deliberately placed animal skulls, intact pottery vessels, or sherds reassembled in circular arrangements, occasionally mixed with human remains. None of these combinations can be explained as dumping waste. This is what archaeologists call structured deposition, meaning intentional ritual burial. Specific animal skulls oriented toward specific compass directions. Broken pottery fragments collected and rearranged into deliberate patterns. Someone was communicating with something, and that something was underground. These pits were understood as gateways to a world below. Every time a hillfort was expanded or repaired, or at particular seasonal moments, the community performed the act of burying these symbolically loaded objects as a kind of contract. The land gives us space and food. We give back ritual and material offerings. The bone deposits found near the Danebury entrance show the same quality. Horse skulls and dog bones, deliberately fragmented and rearranged, interpreted as connected to periodic ritual activity, focused on the threshold zone. The entrance was not just a passageway. It was a liminal space, a boundary between inside and outside that required ritual handling. Events at scale. Rituals with a coherent system behind them. Storage under centralized management. This is a complete product offering, not a wall. The main defensive earthworks at Maiden Castle represent a total soil volume of over 200,000 cubic meters. Experimental archaeology calculations based on Iron Age tool efficiencies put the labor requirement at hundreds of workers sustained over months or even years. But the more important finding is that this was not built all at once. Ditches were repeatedly deepened. Ramparts were raised multiple times. Radiocarbon dating shows that the heightening of many earthen banks stretched across multiple generations, people returning every few decades to add another layer. This means construction itself was a recurring social event. Each return and each new phase of building was an act of community mobilization, an affirmation of collective identity, a convergence of labor under a shared purpose. The sweat went into every layer of compacted earth, and the hillfort became in some meaningful sense a collective biography. Foundational deposits at the base of ditches give the most concrete evidence for this. Multiple sites show that the very bottom of newly dug ditches contained animal skulls, complete pottery, and human remains mixed together. These are the remains of opening ceremonies. Construction had a launch event. This logic maps onto contemporary experience without any difficulty. A major brand event is not just about the product being sold. The process of building the venue and setting up the space is itself producing identification and belonging. The periodic expansion of a hillfort every few decades worked exactly the same way. LiDAR data transformed our understanding of how hillforts related to each other across the landscape. Airborne laser scanning can see through vegetation and reveal surface microtopography, and what it revealed was this. Systematic surveys in Herefordshire found that hillforts were connected to each other through trackways, field boundaries, and smaller enclosure sites, forming a hierarchically structured landscape network. Major hillforts served as regional nodes. Surrounding smaller enclosures formed a secondary network. Viewshed analysis confirmed that these connections were intentional. The mutual visibility between major hillforts is not a product of landscape chance. It was a consequence of deliberate siting decisions. This is a distributed system. No single center, but the whole network sustained through multiple nodes operating in alternation. Different hill fort locations performing similar assembly, distribution, and ritual functions at different times, constituting an organizational structure that stretched across geographical distance. The logic of a franchise. Each hill fort is one execution node of the same underlying system. We spent 200 years calling these places fortresses and working hard to find war inside them. What we found instead was grain accounting, feasting deposits, ritual pit complexes, carefully engineered entrance corridors, and construction records spanning multiple human generations. Controlling who stores grain, who enters first, whose voice gets heard at the assembly. That is power. But this particular form of power did not depend on swords. It depended on spatial design, on periodic collective events, and on social rituals that brought people back again and again. The earthen ring was the logo. The logo made it recognizable from miles away. But the product was everything that happened once you were inside.